There's something I've learned from working with end-of-life patients. And even now, it still unsettles me. The problem almost never starts when someone arrives. At the hospital. It's been happening long before that. People just didn't notice or chose not to see it as important. My name is Renata. I've been a nurse for 11 years. And when you spend that much time inside quiet rooms, sitting with people in their final days, you start to notice patterns that don't show up in medical charts, that they show up in conversations, in regrets, in the way people look back at their own lives, when there's nothing left to change. And there's one thing that repeats itself, over and over again. Almost no one reaches the end because of one big mistake. It's not about a single moment. Not about that one day everything went wrong. It's about what was slowly pushed aside. Little by little. I've heard patients talk about phone calls they never returned. Appointments they kept postponing just a bit longer. Fatigue they ignored because it's probably nothing. Relationships that drifted without anyone noticing when it really started. And the strange part is, when they talk about it, none of it sounds serious. It all feels ordinary, routine, almost invisible. But when you put it all together, it becomes an entire life shaped by small neglects. And that's when it hits. Because in the end, no one points to a single mistake. They talk about accumulation. Days that slipped by too quickly. Signs that seemed too minor to stop everything. Decisions that were never really made, just delayed. I remember one patient who told me, in a calm voice that stayed with me more than any panic ever could. I thought I still had time to fix things. And she wasn't talking about just one thing. She meant everything. Her whole life had been lived in postponement. And that's the pattern that scares me the most. Because it doesn't feel dangerous while it's happening. There's no urgency, no alarm, no immediate pain. Just a quiet feeling of I'll deal with it later. And most of the time, that later comes too late. There was a patient I took care of for a few days. And even now, I still remember small details that never make it into any medical chart. His name was Carlos. Early 60s. He didn't look like someone at the end. The kind of person you could have seen on the street weeks before, and not thought twice about. He arrived at the hospital in the middle of the afternoon. I remember because the hallway was still busy, carts moving, people coming and going, everything working like usual. But he wasn't. He was quiet, sitting on the bed, hands resting on his legs, staring ahead like he was trying to understand how he ended up there. It wasn't sharp pain. It wasn't a dramatic emergency. It was a different kind of exhaustion. His daughter was with him. She talked a lot, explained everything for him like she needed to fill the silence he kept leaving behind. He's always been very active. He never gets sick. This must be just a phase. I've heard those sentences so many times. They almost sound the same, even when they come from different people. While she spoke, he just nodded slightly, not correcting, not adding anything, like someone who didn't even have the energy to disagree with his own story. That first night, I went into the room a few times. Dim lights, TV on, no sound. He was awake, but distant. At one point, I asked if he was feeling anything. He took a few seconds to answer, and when he did, it wasn't what I expected. I thought it was just fatigue. There was no panic in his voice, no fear. Just confusion, like he was trying to fit everything into a logic that no longer made sense. Over the next days, small details started to surface. He barely ate, slept in short, broken cycles, spoke very little. His daughter grew more restless, She brought clothes from home, tried to organize the room, talked about when he would get better. But something didn't match that narrative. His body wasn't responding like someone who would recover quickly. It felt like he had been tired for much longer than those days revealed. And slowly, through conversation, pieces started to come together. He had stopped seeing friends, stopped going on walks that used to be routine, ignored medical appointments, said he was too busy. Even though he was retired, his eating became simpler, then irregular. His sleep, lighter and more fragmented. But none of it happened all at once. It was gradual. So gradual that no one noticed exactly when it stopped being normal. Including him. Because everything had a reasonable explanation. Just this week. I'll deal with it later. It's probably nothing. And like that, life adjusted itself around discomfort. Until discomfort became the new normal. On the last night I took care of him, the room was even quieter. His daughter spoke less, sat more. He was still there, but more distant than on the first day. And at one point, when it was just the two of us, he looked at me. Really looked, for the first time. It wasn't fear. It was the look of someone who finally understood something. Too late to act on it. And he said, almost in a whisper, I kept letting things slide. And stopped. Didn't finish the sentence. But he didn't need to. After he said, I kept letting things slide, I started paying closer attention to the small things still happening around him. Because most of the time, the real conflict isn't in what someone says. It's in what they can no longer do. Carlos began needing help with simple things. Things that, just months earlier, he probably did without even thinking. Sitting up in bed took effort. Drinking water became a slow pause between each sip. Even answering questions seemed more exhausting than it should be. And this didn't happen overnight. It felt like his body had been going through this process for a long time. Only now it was impossible to hide. His daughter still tried to hold on to a sense of normal life. She talked about bills, about the house, about things he would need to handle once he got out. But there was one detail that changed everything. He no longer responded like someone who was going back to that life. He listened, but didn't engage. As if those concerns no longer belonged to him. And that's something I've seen many times. Life keeps moving around the person, but they slowly begin to disconnect from it, not through a clear decision, but through exhaustion. In the following days, more signs appeared. His awareness was still there, but less consistent. Sometimes he would start a sentence and stop halfway. Other times he stayed silent when someone expected an answer. And it wasn't ordinary forgetfulness. It felt like he was conserving energy even to think. One morning, I helped him try to stand. He tried. Genuinely. But his body didn't respond. And in that moment, what showed up wasn't frustration. It was acceptance. A quiet, almost invisible kind of acceptance, but very clear to someone who has seen this before. He didn't ask, why is this happening? He didn't complain. He just stopped trying. That's where the conflict deepens. Because from the outside, it looks like everything happened quickly. But it didn't. That was just the visible part of a process that had been unfolding for a long time. Built on small concessions. Small, not today. Small, I'll deal with it later. Small, it's nothing serious. And the hardest part to witness is that no one sees the exact moment when things could still have changed. Because there is no clear line. No point separating. There's still time from it's too late. There's only a sequence of ordinary days where someone slowly lets go of parts of their own life without realizing it. Until one day, when they try to take it back. They can't anymore. In one of the last longer conversations I saw between him and his daughter, she asked if he wanted her to bring something from home. Food. An object. Something that was his. He took a while to answer, looked around the room, like he was searching for some kind of reference, and said, "I don't think it makes a difference." And that sentence wasn't about the room. It was about everything. It was that same night, after that short conversation, that I understood something I still can't ignore to this day. The problem was never what brought Carlos to the hospital. It wasn't the diagnosis. It wasn't his body suddenly failing. It wasn't that thing that showed up in the final days. That was just the end of a process. What really brought him there was everything he had been letting slide long before. And the hardest part to accept is that, from the outside, nothing ever looked serious enough to lead to that ending. There wasn't one big mistake. There wasn't a defining moment that changed everything. There was a sequence of small choices, almost invisible. And that's exactly what makes it dangerous. Because we're taught to fear big events, serious illnesses, accidents, unexpected news. But working inside those rooms, I started realizing that what leads most people there rarely arrives like that. It comes slowly, disguised as routine, as normal fatigue, as things everyone goes through. And before you notice, it becomes part of life. I kept thinking about him after my shift. But over time, I realized it wasn't really about him, because I had seen it before. In different people, different stories, different ages. But always the same kind of path. People who didn't see themselves as negligent. People who didn't think they were doing anything wrong. Actually, the opposite. Responsible people. People who took care of many things in life. Except, they slowly stopped taking care of themselves. Gradually. Without realizing it. And it doesn't show up in obvious ways. There's no moment where someone says, "Now I'm giving up on myself." It happens quietly. When someone stops checking a symptom, when they ignore emotional discomfort, when they drift away from people who matter, without noticing the distance growing. And what's most striking is that when they get here, almost all of them say some version of the same sentence. "I didn't think it would get to this point." And it's not denial. It's genuine surprise, because while they were living it, it still felt like everything was under control, even when it wasn't. That's when I truly understood. The end of life doesn't begin at the end, it begins in the accumulation of things. We learn to ignore. And the quieter that accumulation is, the more inevitable it becomes. After years of witnessing stories like Carlos, what stayed with me the most wasn't the ending. It was the path. Because it's too quiet to feel alarming, and too common to be questioned. And that's exactly why almost everyone ignores it. There's a truth that took me a long time to accept, even working in this environment every day. People don't lose their lives all at once. They give them away in small pieces. It's not a conscious decision. No. One wakes up and says, "Today I'm going to give up my health, my relationships, my independence." It happens in small moments. When you choose not to look at something that's been bothering you for a while. When you postpone care you know you should take now. When you get used to discomfort just because it's still manageable. And the problem is, what's manageable today becomes normal tomorrow. And after a while, you don't even remember what it felt like before. I've seen strong people become dependent. Present people become distant. Clear minds slowly fade. And most of the time, it's not because something suddenly happened. It's because something was ignored for too long. If there's one thing all these stories have in common, It's the late realization that there were signs. There always were. That they were small enough to be postponed. And that later is what builds the ending. The hospital doesn't change everything. It only reveals what was already happening. In silence. And I'm not saying this to scare anyone. Or as an exaggerated warning. Saying this as someone who has stood beside many beds. Listening to people try to make sense of their lives. When there's no time left to change direction. And in the end, what weighs the most? Isn't what happened. It's what was ignored. Because most of the time, something could have been done. It just didn't feel urgent enough. And maybe that's what stays with me. After every shift. Not the ones who made it here, but the ones who still believe they have all the time in the world, while quietly leaving things for later.